Hello everyone, it's David here and I'm back with another liquid alphabet breakdown tutorial thingy. Today I'm going to focus on this sim, which is I created this back in the day when there was a thing called the Realflow render kit, which was mainly just to try out those features. And if you look at this little nano breakdown that I have here, you can see kind of the way I did it. I simulated the domain first of all, and then I took that velocity channel inside of Maya and blended it so that we got another shader in those areas. And then we opened up the boundaries and we used the extension feature to get a bigger spread, and then we used the fall off to smooth it out, and then last but not least we displaced it inside of Maya at render time, and then to get rid of repetitions I did it twice. That's pretty much the way I did it, and we are going to just have to do a bit of detective work actually to play with all the separate features and talk about how we can combine them into, you know, whatever works for our sim. It was a pretty cool toolkit. It allowed you to do the sim in Realflow and then import it into Maya and do the meshing in Maya straight to Arnold, which I mean, processing wise you're probably not saving time, but you are indeed saving time when it comes to disk space and things like that. This feature sadly isn't available anymore. I can understand why they removed it, because they would have to kind of try to support all the renderers, and honestly I think they only had like RenderMan and Mental Ray and Arnold, and then it disappeared. But the sad story is that this functionality is not really out there. There is the Realflow plugins inside of the DCCs for Maya, Max, and Cinema, but nothing that really replaces this functionality, and especially the part where we use the velocity data inside of the shading is bit disappointing actually. It's supposed to be possible to export velocity to your mesh, but it doesn't really work. I suspect it's pretty much a bug actually that's just stuck around and never gotten fixed. So first things first, this is our the first time we're talking about Hybrido, so I need to go through the basics of that, basic sim and basic meshing, and then we'll get in part 2, we'll get to displacement features and repetition and open domain and things like that. I hope you will enjoy it, and thanks for tuning in. So first things first, here we have an empty scene, and let's get familiar with Hybrido. Hybrido, as the name suggests, is a hybrid between a fluid sim and a particle sim. And it's important here to distinguish between fluids and liquids. Fluid, although the name can be kind of confusing, is not typically what we use for liquid sims, but rather smoke sims and fire sims. And a hybrid between the two of those, Hybrido is related under the hood to flip solvers, which you probably have heard of, is a more kind of established name in this world. And a flip sim is a fluid implicit particle sim. That's what flip stands for. And it essentially means that under the hood there's a voxel grid which calculates, you know, all the motion in the liquid, and then inside of each voxel we create a number of particles in order to be able to mesh it in the end. So essentially the same thing as a flip solver, but this is Next Limit's take on it here in Realflow, and we can access Hybrido sims here on the Hybrido shelf is where we will work for now. The main thing, Hybrido is supposed to be, you know, your go-to for creating large-scale simulations or anything that kind of needs details after the fact, like splash, foam, splash and bubbles, waterline, you know, all of these from the fourth icon from the left and all the way down here is just secondary emitters, which we'll get to probably not today, but it's good to know that you can kind of run the sim first and then you can cache it, and then you can just on top of the sim create your foam and whatnot. So like anytime you actually need like a water tank or something like that, this is going to be your go-to because it's the fastest way to set it up. And we're going to set up first of all by clicking this open domain. And there we have created like the base for our simulation. This is where we can connect our emitters, our colliders, and our daemons. But you'll notice that there's also a closed domain. So let's investigate first of all the difference between the two of those. And a closed domain is going to give you instantly the question, how big is the domain? What type is the domain? Is it top closed or top open? So that a splash could escape up top. And how deep will the water level be? So let's say that we created 10 by 10 by 10, and a top closed or open doesn't really matter in this case, and let's set the water level, say, to 2 meters. So this is what we get then. Let's delete that open one that I first created, and let's just pick this apart. So they created, first of all, a manipulator, which is just going to be like a parent, so that you can move the whole thing around without being concerned about the individual transforms for each of the underlying components. So this could come in handy, like if you want to quickly just rescale the whole thing. And then there's of course the domain. There's a emitter. There's a geo that defines where the emitter is going to emit water, and then there's a geo that defines the domain itself. So let's see if we would set up this from scratch. The things we would do is create an open domain, and an open domain is only open until you actually add a collider. In this case, let's say we make it the same size, 10 by 10 by 10, and connect it up, and then tell it in the volume settings here that this is a solid on the outside. And that means that anything on the outside here is going to be rigid and no particles are going to be able to live there. And we're going to see this in effect in just a bit. And then they created a second cube, which represented the emission, and it was 10 by 2 by 10. Remember, we set the water level to 2, so 2 units in the y-axis, and then they snugly fit it on the bottom for us there, which is, I guess, kind of a help. Could be nice. But I can just eyeball it here and then round it off to -4. And then, with that selected, I will create a Hybrido emitter and just make sure on the emitter settings that the cube that I had selected is used as the object, and that it's a static emission, not a stream. So it's not going to keep pouring. It's just going to be filling the volume once. And then we connect that emitter, and that is essentially it. If we want to completely replicate the setup they had, we could also create a null, and we could take both the cubes and the domain and parent them under the null. So I just named the domain geo into domain geo, the collider for the domain that is, which is solid on the outside. And then the emission geo, I named it water geo, just to keep things clear. And now I'm just going to run through my laundry list here and connect up the standard daemons that we always create and give ourselves a text. I'm just going to stick to the script by creating a B, and bear with me as I give this some movement. So I'm going to start in the corner. Keyframe in position. I'm just going to run 100 frames. I set that before I continued the recording, in case you're wondering. I want to spend too much time in this basic example. And let's do a sine expression here. So 45 plus sine, or rather 30 sine, and 2t I think is going to be alright in terms of frequency. Just want a bit of motion in the liquid, that's all. And let's run for the first time without command line and see what we get initially. Go to first frame, of course. And maybe we should have looked in another viewport aside from the top one as well. Let's just revisit the keyframing as far as I can just delete the Y channel and set it manually because it doesn't need to be animated. I'll just stick it in there. And last but not least, let's of course connect the text into the domain. and reset and run again. So a few things to be aware of, like in terms of quality settings. We already discussed that when we're dealing with Hybrido and we are wanting to get more detail, which we obviously want to do in this case, the standard thing you do is go to the domain and you lower the cell size, which is going to fit more voxels, and each voxels has a certain number of particles distributed inside of it in order to create the final mesh. So thus that increases the quality. So I just lowered it to 0.2 and let's sim again and see how many particles we get. You don't want to crank this, you know, to your heart's content before you actually see the result, because chances are that you're going to end up in a situation where you have a super slow sim that you don't really know what you're going to get. So you want to gradually increase this. And it's not a linear relationship. You can't expect, you know, an increase or a decrease from 0.2 to 0.1 to give you double. It's probably going to be way more than that. You might end up with 5 million all of a sudden, because what you're dealing with is the size of a voxel. So that means more voxels are going to fit in width, depth, and height. And then for each voxel, you have a certain number of particles. So it easily goes overboard if you crank it too much. The next thing you want to do, once you actually start seeing some type of satisfactory motion in the liquid and you start to feel like I could live with this, then you probably are going to see, like in areas where there are splashes, you're probably going to have not enough particles in order to create a satisfactory mesh. So then what you can do, if you don't want to keep decreasing the cell size, because that obviously takes longer to sim and takes up disk space and whatnot, you can also go to the emitter and you can play with the sampling settings and the bandwidth settings. So to make it really simple, what we can do is increase the core particle sampling. So like the overall bulk of the fluid, how many particles are going to be sampled on each voxel. And it's not just 2 particles, it's 2 by 2 by 2 particles, because a voxel is a 3-dimensional component. And then we have surface particle sampling. So we could do, for example, just the surface, just the top band of the liquid, do more particles there. So what we're looking at here is the surface bandwidth, which says pretty much that from the surface layer and to a depth of 0.1 meters, we're going to use this many particles. So if I put 3 instead, we have 3 by 3 by 3 particles, which means 27 particles for the top 0.1 meters of liquid. Let's see if we can see this. Let's reset and sim again. And you can see a clear band going across here. And also this actually is considered the surface. So you actually get more particles all around the edges there. And that's a pretty good, I mean, you don't want to waste too many particles in the center here. And another thing to be aware of in terms of quality is the way that your collider is being interpreted. So for this collision object, I have a cell size as well. And we can preview this just like we did in the crash course with the dancer. We can go down to display volume and show the ISO surface. And that allows us to see how the underlying collision object is being created. So if it's not, you know, following the way you want it to, you could decrease the cell size. So this is another cell size which is individual from the cell size of the domain. And you should be setting these individually to keep it optimized. And if you need the sim to see it sooner, if you think that it's kind of penetrating into the mesh or the particles without showing any displacement of the fluid, you can tackle that with surface offset to kind of, in a sense, you know, like dilate it, puff it up a bit. Typically don't want to do that if you have high enough, but sometimes, you know, you need to do that if you have a complex shape. Obviously what we're dealing with here is a super simple shape, so it should not be something you need to crank too much. I'm going to settle for something like that. Then you can also set the cell size by going down, right down here, way above the playback controls. You have scale options, and you can set a multiplier for all of the cell size scales in the entire scene, which is by default set to 1, and I like to individually trim these to my needs. But if you're in a rush and you just want to, you know, double the detail or the precision in the sim, you could go in and set this to 0.5 maybe. That would mean in this case that the cell size for the collider would be 0.025 and the cell size for the domain would be 0.1. So you just need to be aware of what you're doing there. And like I said, I like to just tweak these individually. But if you're ever in the need, then this is where you find it. And last but not least, if you're having, let me just turn off the ISO surface. If you're having issues with your collider maybe poking into the fluid without displacing it, like if you have a fast moving object, obviously that's not the case for me, but options, Hybrido, and I should mention, of course, this is a drop down, so click and hold, options, go to the Hybrido section where you can introduce additional substeps. And this is quite a beautiful thing with Hybrido, that you can run these large scale sims with so few substeps really. And that's really why Hybrido came into the world, or flip sims to that matter, so that we can more efficiently run big scale sims without, you know, creating all of those substeps that we would need to do for standard SPH sims. So the default is 1 and 2, which is usually enough, and that's a good thing, because there are other factors that's going to bog down your system when it comes to Hybrido sims. Usually they end up pretty large. But if you need to, you can raise this. You can also just play with the strictness. So the higher this goes, it's going to bias the sim to pick the maximum substeps rather than the minimum. So if you maybe take this to 0.8 or something, maybe that's going to give you an overall higher substep without tweaking it too much. So let's just, with the new settings, run this and see. We still obviously need a smaller cell size. I'm going to go to command line now, and let's just not forget how many we had. We had 323,000 particles. So if we start to sim now, so as the first frame completes, I can see that I went from that to 2.2 million particles. So you can clearly see that it scales exponentially, and you can easily end up in a situation where you have a lot more particles than you expected. That being said, I mean, a Hybrido sim, what we're doing here is a 10 by 10 meter water tank with a depth of 2 meters. So if you're doing part of an ocean where a boat is traveling across, you easily end up in the neighborhood of double digits for millions of particles, or sometimes even hundreds of millions of particles. The sim is progressing nicely. I'm about 60, almost 70 frames in, and it's running about 10 seconds per frame, which is, you know, still a preview resolution. It's not final production quality, but it's not unusual for these things to go a couple of minutes per frame in the end. Let's just load up what we have so far and look at a frame. Maybe we need to adjust our display settings. Let's see if we have, we have automatic range. Sometimes I like to clamp it down. You can see in the stats up here that the Vmax on this current frame, so you would just go to the frame that you think has the fastest moving liquid to kind of get a ballpark. But you can see that between 0.0002 and 9.8. So that should be your range. Otherwise you're clamping. But sometimes clamping is good. So if I set it to auto range, it's probably gonna have the same settings, but maybe you want to filter out, you know, the very, very smallest velocities, because otherwise that can kind of start to show you jitters and pops. And the max range, if we set it to around 10, which it is right now, I might want a bit more contrast actually. So I'm going to force particles with even lower velocity to light up on the upper end of the spectrum here. So I'm clamping it quite aggressively, but that's what I want in this case. I want to be able to see what kind of details I have in here. And things I might be tweaking if this was not looking the way I was hoping could be, for example, setting, if you think it's kicking up too much velocity, you could maybe play with the interaction factor, or vice versa if you need more. And you obviously have the grid friction, and you also have on the domain something called Vorticity Boost, which I tend to use if I want more kind of swirly details in the fluid. To get a more turbulent fluid, increase this factor, but try to avoid very high values. It's a little hard to describe what it does, but you know, vorticity is kind of like what the attribute that describes these swirly patterns that we get once the velocity kind of starts to dissipate, as the velocity of the liquid kind of settles down in swirls or whirlpools. So you can kind of guess your way to this. I would just play with this if I were you. And that being said, I think for this example, let's just go to meshing right now.